true that many gifted women have had to struggle to become artists against a continuous barrage of indifference, dislike, and envy. And it is true in the field of photography as in other fields. Lights, please. Lights. Lights, please. And we might indeed have a slide. Nevertheless, there are some very famous American photographers, women photographers, and in one or two fields, I think they clearly, again, take a leading part. And I thought I'd just start off by reminding you of their names. And the name of one of them is, of course, Imogen Cunningham. And when you look at this photo, which was taken about 1925, you're immediately reminded of another woman artist, aren't you? Georgia O'Keeffe. And from a close-up of a human face as depicted by Guibert of Toulouse-Lautrec or Sir Henry Taylor by Julia Margaret Cameron, to a close-up of a flower. We could have a next, which is another Imogen Cunningham. And it suggests that when women photographers care to be portraitists, they have a kind of candid magnificence, which is very surprising. Once again, you might recognize a feminist connection, mightn't you? Who is this formidable rock cake of a lady? Gertrude Stein. Yes. And it's a formidable personage, and it's a formidable photograph. Indeed, one of the most famous photographs, I suppose, of all times, not necessarily the greatest, let's have a look at the next, is actually very familiar to you, isn't it? Dorothea Lange. And that is particularly interesting because Dorothea Lange is, after all, a photographer sociologist. And her photographs of migrant laborers, of the rural poor in the South and in California, are not really primarily, I think, important in the history of art. They're important in the history of social institutions. And that raises, once again, the speculative issue about photography in respect to, is it really an art? If it is an art, then it has a very particularly interesting quality. It's an art which is more dependent upon content than we normally like to think art is. In the 20th century, we have really, I think, more or less all of us, at some stage or other, fallen into the notion of art for art's sake, an art as being a process, a technique, a means of self-expression, rather than art as a comment, art as a reflection of the world, art as a means of dealing through imitation, through distortion, through variation, a means of dealing with our experience of daily life. That tendency to think of art as separate from life, which is immortalized in a French historian's title, L'art loin de la vie, art a long way from life, really starts in the middle of the 19th century. And it starts partly, I think, in opposition to the nature of photography. But partly it starts at a deeper level, the revolt of artists from society, and the insistence of many artists that art is a separate domain. An insistence which ultimately you find wonderfully reflected in one of the remarks, of Oscar Wilde, where he says that, of course, nature imitates art, rather than art imitating nature. And what that says is that art is the primary world, it's the primary vision. And of course, you have all experienced at some stage or other the way in which nature does imitate art. You look at a Vermeer of a young woman, and then you suddenly look at the young woman, and she has the same rather liquid lips and glaucous eyes. You look at Michelangelo's creation of Adam, and you look across at your young gentleman, and you see that he almost has Adam's magnificent rib cage. You look at a tree and you suddenly say, my God, that was planted by Constable. You look at a sunset and you say, oh my God, that was painted by F.E. Church. But the fact is that the whole notion of art for art's sake, its autonomy, leads, I think, in the direction of non-figurative art, and it leads, therefore, away from content. Now, photography maintains content to an extraordinary degree. It is perfectly true that in the 20th century we find photographs, for instance, of microscopic situations, microphotographs, which of course don't look like anything we see through the naked eye. But nonetheless, that kind of photography is deeply involved with the content of the ordinary world. And indeed, the Imogen Cunningham, which I first showed you, which is on the way to microphotography, by its close-up of the organs of a flower, is a long way towards microphotography. But it retains its sense of content. And perhaps our uneasiness about recognizing photography as an art is simply because we don't care for art with content. Anyhow, I'm going to pursue that in a little while. I'd like you to simmer it over in your minds, because the thing that I really failed to do on Wednesday, I need finally to do, which is to do due justice to Julia Margaret Cameron, who ended her days, by the way, in Ceylon. Her husband was an extremely eccentric Indian civil servant who finally went back to Sri Lanka. And there are some late photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron of the people of Sri Lanka. But here we have once again another view of Sir John Herschel, the famous astronomer, and you can see that he had the most marvelous hair and that he hadn't shaved very recently. And then he has these deep puckered eyes and puckered forehead, and the sense of inward power of inward and outward gazing is astonishingly caught. And one of the things you might well say is, of course, yes, Julia Margaret Cameron must have studied Rembrandt. And I think that the answer is certainly. And if we look at the whole development of 19th century photography, again, we are conscious of the way in which photographers borrow the conventions of many different periods and kinds of painting, but few with such skill as Cameron. Here's another view of her neighbor Alfred Tennyson, one where he looks a little bit less dyspeptic and a little bit more poetic, but you do wonder, don't you, exactly what's going on under the moustache, what actually his mouth is all about. And you get that sense of his short-sightedness. You get a sense of his tremendous untidiness and his wildness and his self-conscious adoption of the pose of the bard. And I think in Cameron there's an interesting quality, just quietly there, of saying, gee, these great guys do think an awful lot of themselves. There's a little poking of fun, I think, as well as hero worship. And that's such a fascinating combination. Let's have a look at the next. I'm going to show you now something which I think really is very interesting. And that is a whole series of portraits of Carlisle. Carlisle was the great apostle of work in the 19th century, a bilious Scottish philosopher who suddenly became famous in the 1830s when he wrote A History of the French Revolution. He was enormously admired while being extremely cantankerous. a very difficult sense of humor, and a strange man. His wife was a very unfortunate lady. She wasn't very happy in herself, and she was married to him. And the famous remark of a critic was, how good of God to marry Thomas Carlyle to Jane Welsh Carlyle, thus making 2 people unhappy instead of 4. Anyhow, here is Carlyle seen in profile by Julia Margaret Cameron. And I think it's a very fascinating comparison with the next, could we have a look at the next, which would be a very familiar painting to you. It is a painting of Carlyle by the American James Mcneill Whistler, who is more familiar to you from his portrait of his mother. But this is arranged in the same kind of way. And of course, Whistler was one of the great apostles of art for art's sake. You all know the famous remark of Whistler, when somebody said, "Oh, Mr. Whistler, why in this nocturne, which you call a nocturne in blue and silver, why is there some red and some yellow?" And Whistler replied, "Do you suppose, my dear sir, that in a nocturne in F minor, Chopin would simply repeat the note F, 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 fool?" And Whistler's well worth reading because he's an extraordinarily witty writer as well as an extraordinary painter. But if we're talking about in terms of portrait, it doesn't, in fact, Cameron actually give you a much deeper sense of that strange personality. Whistler gives you a lovely sense of an elegant gentleman with a handsome hat and a useful piece of shirt collar. But he is ever so much an arrangement, isn't he? Whereas Cameron gives you an arrangement, but also a profoundly fascinating and disturbing personality. This is by Sir Edgar Boehm, and is a sculpture of Whistler. And as you can see, you wouldn't terribly enjoy having Whistler as an advisor. He would give you pretty short shrift. There's something remarkably strange and slightly cruel about the way the eyebrow comes down at the top of the nose, and you could imagine him emitting the most tremendous sneer imaginable in his Scottish brogue. Or let's look at the next, which is a portrait by Sir John Everett Millais, the Pre-Raphaelite. You can see that all of them have something of Carlyle, don't they? But compare this rather tidied up fellow, reproachful, and quite cross at the corners of his mouth. Compare, however, that rather tidied up creature with another Julia Margaret Cameron version, with such wonderfully rich darks. Let me say one other thing, that of course these are very poor slides of the photographs. And one of the things that you have to recognize is that photographs are made into slides in the most careless fashion, much more careless than the way paintings are made into slides. They don't bother to go to the original prints. They don't bother to photograph them carefully for the slides, and so that the real richness of Cameron's work, and its marvelous contrast of light and dark, its deep Rembrandtian quality, is rather lost. But such marvelous, and you feel now what horrible whiskers he had. And you pity poor Jane Welsh Carlyle, who describes her wedding night as a rather futile jogging up and down. And you get such a deep sense of the personality. Well, of course, it's interesting to compare Julia Margaret Cameron not with other male painters, but with female painters. And here is one of my favorite images of Berthe Morisot, and it's a beautiful painting. But it has a kind of sweetness which is far away from the essential penetration and variety of response which Julia Margaret Cameron achieves. Beautiful painting though it is. And here is another Morisot, and I wanted to compare it with one other woman painter of the photographer of the 1850s and 1860s. Her name was Clementina Harada, and she was much more, I think, than Cameron, an amateur. Of course, all photographers, when photography started off, were in a sense amateurs because there was no profession. But Clementina Harada was married to a nobleman, and she took up photography for no apparently strong reason. She died rather young, and there's just a rather small sheaf of these photographs. They're almost all about women. They're almost all about extremely beautiful women in very, very rich costume, and very often they're posed against a mirror or against a window, or they're sitting on a balcony. They are photographs, you might say, by the idle rich, about the idle rich. And yet they are of an extraordinary romantic sensitivity. I can only show you two of them, but I hope some of you, there's another one, I hope some of you will want to explore Lady Hawarden, Hawarden, a little bit more. She'd make an excellent topic for a paper. And indeed, to compare her with somebody like Dorothea Lange would be most amusing, diverting, and fundamentally very informative. Or to compare Hawarden with Cassatt, and here's a Cassatt, Mary Cassatt, the American painter who went and lived in Europe and became a great friend of Degas. So I'm throwing these at you partly to stimulate your final papers, also to diversify your curiosity a certain amount. But what I want to go on now and do is to talk a little bit more about, I can't give you the whole history of photography. That's a complicated issue which would take many, many weeks. But one of the things that becomes very clear is that photography gets involved in every kind of rapportage. And this is a photograph of the 1870s, and what it reveals, of course, is the daily life of the lower orders in a large city. And these are scavengers, and they're in England, and they're scavenging under the supervision of a rather dreadful top-hatted person. And then this is another photograph, anonymous photograph from the late 1880s or 1890s of just newspaper vendors. And you can see that that kind of rapportage, which can be well done or badly done, remains enormously a part of the whole business of photography. And the photographer becomes a visual journalist. What I want you to think a little bit about, however, is the limitations of photography in visual journalism for a very long time. Because in the early days, it was very, very expensive to reproduce a photograph in large quantities. What happened to the photograph, if you wanted to make it into popular journalism, you had to, shedding the wrong kind of light, my dear boy, but never mind. You had to wood engrave it onto a wood block, and then you could print it in a newspaper. And indeed, as late as the 1880s and 1890s, before you had the half-tone block, you couldn't easily, immediately transmit a photograph into a daily paper. There's another obvious limitation of the photograph, and that is color. And then there's a third limitation, and that is size. And in terms of works of art, these are extremely important limitations. We can, however, carry on and have a look at a little bit more rapportage. Of course, you could have the rapportage of daily life of society. In fact, some photographers were much more adventurous and immediately began in the 1850s and 1860s to become war reporters. And here is a famous photographer called Roger Fenton, who went off to the first major European war available after the invention of photography, which was the Crimean War. And this is Guibert, I think, or is it Canrobert, one of the great and inefficient French generals in the Crimea. And you can see it's an absolutely marvelous photograph. He's such a bellicose creature, and how he glitters with his orders and his grand boots, and how self-conscious he is of his military elegance, and how conscious Roger Fenton is of the lights and the darks. And that quality of lights and darks, which you get in Julia Margaret Cameron and you get in Roger Fenton, of course, you also get in the painting of Edouard Manet. And here's another Fenton of the Crimean. But of course, it was very, very difficult to take an action photograph in the first 20, 30 years of photography because your exposure wasn't quick enough. And that, of course, is the great importance one of the great importances of Eardward Muybridge and his work at Stanford, because as well as doing pioneer work in human anatomy and physiology through photography, he also speeded up the exposures and led the way directly into film. And eventually, of course, film is the medium for dire and violent action. But nevertheless, people wanted to do it. Interestingly enough, the sort of war reporters of the Crimea and the American Civil War very often were not photographers, but painters. The Crimea was covered by a famous artist called Constantin Guise, and of course the American Civil War was covered by no less than Winslow Homer. And here we see Winslow Homer, and one of the interesting things is, of course, the composition. And the kind of composition is the sort of composition that a photographer might take if he was very, very courageous. But it has that sort of sense of instantaneousness. And yet you see Homer really has to produce these things as wood engravings. And here is a field of battle. And Homer was a convinced war reporter, as indeed Matthew Brady, the photographer, was. And here is Matthew Brady showing some of the results of the American Civil War. It's interesting because war has continued to engage photographers, and this, which is, I think, one of the most memorable images of war in the 20th century, is taken by Cartier-Bresson and is a scene from Spain in 1938. And look at the content, think about the means of description. In particular, how does this come off compared with this? And you might easily spend some time revolving that. One of the things which does not work well in photography is allegory. Whereas allegory has always been one of the many weapons of a painter. And the allegorical horse here has some advantages. Could we go back one for a moment? The allegorical horse perhaps has some advantages over this poor little chap. But the contact with daily life is often so strong in photography and has often become so weak in the world of painting. And there's something which means, I think, that what has happened over the last 10 years, of which you are all, in fact, either dimly or very acutely conscious, the development of a mood in the visual arts which is deeply influenced by photographic aesthetics, may be a rather hopeful thing, not simply for photographers, but for painters and sculptors as well, because I think it is arguable that it forces people back into a contact with daily life. And of course, that was what was going on through a great deal of the 19th century. But let's have a look at the next. We talked a bit about the realistic impulse in the middle of the 19th century and associated with the name of Courbet. That realistic movement in painting goes on through the rest of the 19th century. Historically speaking, we often forget about it because we become so preoccupied with Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism, with the world of Van Gogh, with the world of Gauguin, with the world of Cézanne. And we believe, of course, that the photograph simply makes it unnecessary for artists to paint scenes from real life. That the photograph knocks naturalism and realism on the head. Well, I'm showing you a very small photograph which actually gives you a good reason to realize that this is not entirely true. You all recognize the girl, you all know the girl. She is Alice Liddell. Now you all know her, don't you? Yes. And you all, I hope, knew that Lewis Carroll, whose real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, was a very considerable amateur photographer. And this is one of his photographs. If you want to read about him as a photographer, read Helmut Gernsheim's little book. But the interesting thing about this photograph is that it's a colored photograph, isn't it? It's a tinted photograph. But you do have to remember that proper color photography doesn't emerge till about 1920. You also have to remember that the daguerreotype was teeny. A daguerreotype is that sort of size. And so it was not possible for photographs just like that to take over the place of 20-foot paintings by somebody like Courbet. And they were used by painters in making their large pictures. Let's have a look at the next. And Courbet himself, I think, was clearly influenced by photography. And Courbet we can see as a realist, but of course the whole concept of realism is a strange concept in some ways. This is possibly Courbet's most famous painting, the artist's studio, 7 years' dream of my artistic life. And of course, nothing could be more substantial or substantiated than the splendid nude, which we have good reason to believe may well have been influenced, if not based upon, influenced by a contemporary photograph by a photographer called Villeneuve. On the other hand, did Courbet ever have all these people, Indian chiefs, Hungarians, huntsmen, moneylenders, all in his studio at the same time, along with Baudelaire and Champfleury and other critics? And the dog and the little boy? Surely not. This, in fact, is what he says it is. It's a dream. It's a funny mixture between realism and a dream reality. And, of course, in fact, it's a long allegory, as well as a realist painting, it's a long allegory on the life of the artist. It is perhaps one of the most important paintings of the 19th century and most fruitful for the 20th century because while it is true that many artists painted their studios before, this is the greatest hymn to the artist's studio that has ever been painted. And think about it for a moment. An enormous quantity of the works of, for instance, Picasso, Matisse, and Braque about the artist's studio. And that has, of course, to do with what I've been telling you again, art for art's sake, and the artist cut off from the daily life of society. But not Mr. Courbet. That's why he assembles all these people over here, because he is a keen huntsman. He's an amateur musician. And why does he assemble the little boy? Because, of course, Courbet wants to say that all these refined and learned critics and art historians have no better taste than a small boy, who is obviously asking Courbet, well, what's that? And then there's another very interesting issue. The little animal, the little cat, of course, is not interested in human art. Notice behind here the figure of a Greek plaster cast, and of course Courbet is saying, away with idealism, away with Greek art. And then something even more strange, he's painting a landscape indoors. It is not really quite clear why the young lady is undressed. She, of course, is also mesmerized by his landscape. Presumably, she may be being about to be popped into it. There's no refined nonsense about where her clothes are. And then in the background on the studio, there's another enormous landscape. It's a vast and complicated painting, which you can read about very well in a book by Kenneth Clark, I think, called, I think he does that, Looking at Pictures. There's also a monograph devoted just to this particular painting by Benedict Nicholson. Anyhow, it raises, let's have a look at the next, it raises some of the issues of realism. And of course, when you look at the detail, you see how wonderfully painted the cat is. and how splendid the chair and how splendid his own legs are, and in particular, right at the center, of course, of the whole canvas is his hand and his palette, and then really a superbly painted figure here, with large biceps, a strong big neck, large double chin, and then this mysterious landscape which is emerging from inside, from indoors, and tells you that Courbet is by no means an impressionist. And the enraptured boy who thinks Courbet is a god, which of course is what Courbet wanted everybody to think. And here we see the intelligentsia on this side of the room, some of them rather puzzled, some of them slightly frivolous, and many of them not knowing quite what to do, and some of them sitting down because they're exhausted. And Baudelaire himself, a friend of Courbet at one stage, deeply involved in reading poetry and taking no notice, quite wisely, you might say. And then on the other side, this motley group of revolutionaries and Garibaldians and goodness knows who, a little scowl just to remind you of mortality, but all painted with a kind of wonderful richness. Well, this image is an important one because it's a painting of Prudhomme. And Prudhomme was a socialist philosopher who wrote about socialism and art. And so that we can see that in some senses Courbet is interested in the relationship between art and society, and refuses to say that art is something which is separate from the interests of society, and is moved towards socialism. And again, it's interesting to think of the way he deliberately shows the children are playing at work, playing at scholarship, and then the thinker himself. And notice the thinker he's a very, very straightforward thinker. He's not thinking in a grand armchair. He's just on a step out of doors. He's perfectly comprehensible as a Californian philosopher. And what it reminds you of is the sort of issue, the relationship between content and style, which is so difficult fully to understand in realism. Is realism primarily concerned with a special content? This is what society is, or is it really concerned with a way of painting the nature of society? And I think you will find it most helpful to use in contradistinction two terms, naturalism and realism. And naturalism, I would suggest to you, is a useful term if you want to talk about a painting which is deeply concerned with the minutest detail of visual appearance of a factual kind, and of visual reality of a factual kind, but is not concerned with social message, whereas realism has that element of social message. So here is Courbet telling you about the terrible life of the road menders and stonebreakers, or here is Courbet telling you about bourgeois preparations for marriage. And of course, what Courbet does in the 1840s and 1850s, and here is Courbet telling you about himself as a heroic young artist and his rather effete patron, Bruyas, and Bruyas' manservant, who carries always a blanket in case Bruyas gets a little bit cold, whereas, of course, Courbet is tremendously stout, healthy, and hearty, and full of the joys of the fresh air. From that world of the middle of the 19th century, a form of realism goes on right till the end of the century. And it goes on not only in France, but in England, and this is an English painting of an industrial subject by William Bell Scott, an iron foundry on the Tyne at Newcastle, and I can show you a couple of interesting details, because those details tell you the intensity with which William Bell Scott, who was a minor pre-Raphaelite, was concerned to give you every aspect of the minutiae, the lading on the docks, the chaffering, every link in this great chain, the whole of the rigging, and then in a yet teenier detail, imagine bothering with all these little elements. And here you see the chisels and the what do you call these things? files, the files with every little runnel in the file carefully depicted. So that not only do you have an important social subject, but you have it depicted with an intense naturalism. And it's interesting to think of Adolph Menze, a German painter who often painted historical scenes, also about the same time, a little bit later, doing another steel foundry. And again, think of the sheer labor involved in getting your mind to understand one of these beastly machines, far less getting your hand to paint it. And then one after another of these machines receding, fortunately eventually into kind of grey mist, so you don't have to be quite so particular back there. And workman after workman, some workmen eating away like mad, other workmen busily engaged in dealing, puddling the molten metal and so on and so forth. It is a German version of Ford Madox Brown's work. And then here is another one which is fascinating, by a French artist. And do you know what these poor women are doing? No, they're not sewing, actually. It's a good guess, but they aren't. What they are doing is they are polishing imitation diamonds. And the reason why I mention that to you is because, first of all, it's so utterly improbable. And secondly, it tells you the kind of subject matter that many a painter, and you can see, how exciting it was. Well, other people have done men working in steel yards and so on and so forth, but I'm going to do women cutting imitation diamonds. And then people going along and say, but have you seen the wonderful painting of the cutters of imitation diamonds? And you know those imitation diamonds are imitated so wonderfully well. And it's so interesting. Did you know that they had to sit on these perfectly dreadful benches and that they work 12 hours a day or 14 hours a day? And of course, what these paintings ministered to is the ripening social conscience of the second half of the 19th century. And they're part of an enormously important effort to interpret industrial society to itself. Most of these paintings are entirely forgotten because they're done in a style which went out when Impressionism really became the favored style of the latter half of the 19th century amongst collectors. And of course, wealthy American industrialists, the Pierpont Morgans or the Harvey Meyers or the Rockefellers or whoever it is, they didn't want lots of photographs of the sweated labor of the brutalized poor. Of course they'd much prefer to buy a Monet or a Renoir, unless they had an irksome social conscience. But there are enormous quantities of these paintings. This is by a man called Ulrich, and I'm not quite sure his origins. I think he's Ulrich. You know what they're doing here? They're making electric lamp bulbs. So this is the first painting of fabricators of electric lamp bulbs. And you can see it's a very well worked out and careful diagonal composition. The drawing of this arm is really quite correct. The hair on this head is too correct. And this ear is done with a kind of startling naturalism which is really rather fearsome. And the variety of the poses, the delicacy of the hand movements, and then imagine the immense effort that went into getting the highlights on all these taps and the highlights on all these stools and the highlights on all these little pieces of glass and so on and so forth. One of the things that you can never, never, never get over is the intense craftsmanship of these paintings. And of course, why were they fascinating to many members of the public? Because they were so clever at illusionism, and because most people, even of course if they worked at cutting imitation diamonds, they didn't know how to make electric light bulbs. And if they made electric light bulbs, they didn't know how to cut imitation diamonds. And people were fascinated by this whole society. And of course the artists themselves felt it must be hymned in some kind of way. And here are, and I think this is a French painting, here are a lot of very poor women doing more elementary kind of labor. They're just preparing vegetables, a subject which is much closer, of course, to Vincent van Gogh. This is different because it just doesn't talk about work. It talks about the disasters of society. Because here is a young man who has been caught up for stealing or some such thing, and he's committed to Newgate. He's being put in prison. And here is his wife trying to talk to him, and here's a jailer behind, and here's another poor woman with her babe who's waiting in order to talk to this person, and so on and so forth. It is a scene dated about 1870, by a man called Frank Holl, whose work was wood engraved for the graphic and had a great influence, as a matter of fact, on Vincent van Gogh. Let's have a look at the next. Here's another one, and you all know what this is. This is the doctor, and why the American Medical Association doesn't use it over and over again. It's so touching, isn't it? Because the doctor has sat up all night in this poor person's house with a single lamp, and the poor little child doesn't have a proper bed. She's perked up on a couple of chairs, both of which would now be extremely expensive, by the way. Her mother is taking a rest in the background, and there's the doctor in his lonely vigil, and of course he's not going to be paid anything very much for this, and he's looking at her and he's willing her to get better. And there was a wonderful, wonderful painting by an artist called Luke Files, who became famous for this kind of painting. And here is one which is so fascinating. I think it's again a French painting. It's a little bit later, possibly the 1890s. And you look at it and you realize at once it's a pretty dull painting in many ways, isn't it? As a painting. And yet it's also very touching, because here are these poor children in a ward, and maybe they're suffering from tuberculosis, and the poor daddy is going to suffer from tuberculosis, and he's absolutely wrapped in it all, and it is so sad and tragic. And then you look at one of the touching things, which if you really look into it in detail, does remind you of your own sick bed. The peeled orange, which is going a bit dry because you don't have the energy to eat all of it. And of course, if you were really not Californians, but late 19th century Europeans, you'd realize what a great luxury that orange was, if you were in the north of Europe. And then you think about the strange and extraordinary technical perfection of the recessions in white, and this white death world, and then this figure in very complicated pose in the foreground. You realize that it's extraordinary and remarkable painting, and not attractive, and certainly not very jolly, but profound and sincere. And there are enormous, let's have a look at the next, enormous quantity of pictures of this kind of world. And sometimes they're painted by a name that you really know. And would anybody care to mention the name here? It's a Degas. It's a Degas, and you see, Degas had this interest in the daily life of people. You can't imagine Renoir doing a painting of people having their corns cut, can you? And you can't really imagine Monet doing such a thing, or Manet, because it's a little inelegant for Manet. But Degas has this capacity to be interested in every kind of daily life, and here is a pedicure, and this strange young woman at such a fascinating odd angle, and here he is, he's about to cut off a bunion, and then she'll be able to walk about again. That's true, of course, of Degas. It's also true of the mysterious and not terribly well-known collector and painter, Caillebotte. Now, Caillebotte patronized Manet and the Impressionists and left his collection to the nation, and this, which he did, I think, in the 1890s, was one of the way of forcing Impressionism onto the state and making sure that people saw it. And he himself was not a bad painter, and here we see a work of his of sanding the floor. And you can see the laboriousness of the painting and the labor involved. I thought you might also be interested in realism, a social realism, if you like, in sculpture. And this is a late 19th century Belgian sculptor called Constant Meunier, M-E-U-N-I-E-R, Meunier, who specialized in workmen of all kinds, foundrymen, miners, stevedores, and here I think is a steel worker in, you notice, a little appropriate helmet, and here's another man in the same kind of industrial costume, and here we see with his characteristic hat, and you see already Constant Meunier in hymning labor really looks on to the sort of social realism which is taken up in the 1930s throughout the world and is very typical of a great deal of Russian post-revolutionary painting, and also actually not untypical of a good deal of fascist art, and is also, of course, not untypical of a great deal of comic strip art, that overdeveloped chin, that sort of slightly brutal handsomeness. It is not surprising that Meunier actually did a monument to Zola, because if we really think about the period of 1850 or 1860 to 1900, the French writer who really dominates it more than anybody else is, I suppose, Zola. Not the greatest artist, but one of the most powerful, insistent, complex writers, and a writer who combined, you see, incessant and insistent accuracy of detail, very often with a kind of emotional ferocity, which one can't really think of as being very much related to daily life. And anyhow, there's Meunier's monument to Zola, and here's Meunier doing a porter. And you may, I think, see also in Constant Meunier, as well as these less agreeable features, you can see something which emerges more fully, perhaps, in some of the work of Catherkolwitz. Catherkolwitz's work people are not totally unlike those of Constant Meunier. Anyhow, so we have these work people, and there we have a painting, and you can see what it is. It's a painting of a wounded workman who's going, of course, to have his leg cut off, and there's a mine in the background, so it's a mining disaster, and maybe he'll survive, maybe he won't. And that reminded me of Degas' great series of seamstresses, ironing away for dear life. And of course, there is a connection between Zola and Degas, just as a connection between Zola and Cézanne. French, Swedish, German, Polish, Italian, English. This is another English one. And this, of course, gets a little bit closer at social propaganda. This is called the casual ward, entering for the casual ward, and these are very like the transients of Santa Cruz, and they're waiting for the ward to open up at night, and here you see is a policeman who is checking over some of the numbers, and here are poor children who are going to get inside and have a night away from the fog and the damp and the snow, and one of the most ill-fed dogs. And this one is by another Englishman called Frank Bromley. It's simply entitled The Hopeless Dawn. And obviously what has happened is they've run out of money and they've run out of hope, and there's nothing much to eat, and mother and daughter in hopeless despair, probably because daddy simply has disappeared. Even more frightening, I think, genuinely frightening, is this by a German painter who came and lived in England, Hubert Herkomer, H-E-R-K-O-M-E-R, Herbert Herkomer, not Hubert. H.H., well, you think it may have been Hubert Herbert. H.H. Herkomer, and it's called The Old Women's Ward in Westminster Hospital. And what it is, of course, is one of the first paintings of a rest home, but a rest home for the very poor. And there they are, making a few flowers which they're going to sell and telling each other stories, and they are, just to add to the poignancy, a young woman who is helping to look after them, and you feel that this lady may somehow have slipped a little bit of, what should we say, meth into her tea. And there they are, a mass of these old ladies with no real future. Considering this being the case, they look relatively cheerful, some of them reading a prayer book and so on and so forth. A deeply alert painting to the miseries and strangeness and picturesqueness, or pictorial possibilities of poverty. And Herkomer does other paintings. Let's have a look at the next, which are in their own way interesting. This one is called Hard Times, and it just simply depicts the fate of migrant laborers, much in the way you see that Dorothea Lange depicts the fate of migrant laborers 30, 40, 50 years later. These are probably Irish laborers. And they've got a few tools, and they've got a family, and they're tramping in search of work. And that whole world, if you want to read some English versions of the life of the very poor, you don't go and read H.G. Wells, because H.G. Wells is just merely lower middle class. You can read Tales of Mean Streets by Arthur Morrison. They are the most frightening stories I know about real poverty. Or you can just go on into the 20th century because, of course, these kind of paintings lead straight into the world of George Orwell and Down and Out in Paris and London, or The Road to Wigan Pier. And in the 1930s, you do find a revival, a small revival of social realism in painting. But the great epoch is from 1860 to about 1900. And if we look at another Herkomer, this is not another Herkomer, this is a French painter of a strike. But let's have a look at another one. This is Herkomer's version of a strike. A fine literal description, though the man seems almost as though he's levitating. This is by a Polish artist whose name is, to me, totally unpronounceable, I'm afraid. And I don't think it's very important. I certainly won't ask you in the final test, please tell me the name of the painter of this famous painting. But the title of it is very interesting. One Step Closer to Siberia, it's called. It was painted by, obviously, a Polish patriot, and this, of course, has immediate, it isn't just social realism, it's political realism, because it's talking about the route march to Siberia, which many a Polish patriot trod in the latter part of the 19th century, and it's a painting about political oppression, so the little chains are really rather important, the small little cache of food, the bare feet, which are enormous, all of this, and the tousled intellectual quality and the exhaustion, and then the young rookie, the young soldier on parade who's appalled by what he's having to do, but does it nonetheless. And you might want to read, in connection with a painting like this, Tolstoy's last great novel called Resurrection, which is about the road to Siberia. And indeed, some of these paintings probably come closer to helping you to understand Tolstoy or Dostoevsky than the Impressionists do. I don't think Renoir and Dostoevsky go very closely together. And finally, I thought you'd like to look at one or two American images of a realist kind. And this is by a man called Anchuse, A-N-S-C-H-U-T-Z. I think his first name is Charles. This was painted in the 1880s, and it's simply a painting of steel mills during the lunch hour. And some of the young men are, of course, practicing some calisthenics, some athletics, and others are just washing themselves or getting ready for a bit of a meal. And in the background is, no, it's Thomas Anchuse. The greatest, I suppose, of the American realists was Thomas Eakins. And I'm convinced he's a very great painter indeed. And here is, I'm showing it to you again, the Grouse Clinic. And it's called the Grouse Clinic after the professor, Professor Grouse, who was a very distinguished Jewish surgeon working in Philadelphia in the 1860s and 1870s. And of course, it is an interesting painting because it has a deeply allegorical aspect. It's a portrait of of an operation. And you then, of course, realize why or where or how it is that television is so deeply preoccupied with mystery in the wing, in the obstetric wing or whatever it is. You know, that endless preoccupation with illness and with the drama of the hospital. But of course, Eakins doesn't invent that. Portrayals of operations go back to Rembrandt. And I think it is interesting, this repetitious sense of Rembrandt being behind some of the painting of the second half of the 19th century. I think it is a time when Rembrandt really becomes understood and deeply appreciated again. And, of course, the light is Rembrandtian. The actual method of painting Professor Gross's face is Rembrandtian. The anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, however, is nothing compared with this, which is deeply, of course, concerned with every detail. When the painting was exhibited, there was a great deal of criticism of Eakins' treatment of the mother, which was thought to be over-sentimental and unfair. But of course here is the recorder, here are the anaesthetists, and here are assistants, and what are they doing? We know exactly. Gross had become famous for making incisions and cutting out tubercular bones. And this is an operation which deals with a tubercular thigh, do you see? In fact, you know, it hung, and maybe still hangs, I can't remember, in one of the great colleges of medicine in Philadelphia. And of course it was painted for Philadelphians who all knew of Professor Gross and knew of his great works on surgery. And how is he seen? He's seen as a hero of his times. And the surgeon is a new kind of hero. It's a portrait of what in the 18th or 17th century might have been a general or an admiral or a monarch. And you might want to compare this kind of painting of a distinguished surgeon with a portrait of Louis XIV or Prince Albert or Philip IV of Spain. I've got an interesting detail, and you see how vividly Eakins portrays the blood on the hands, and it'll tell you something about the date of this picture. How do you know something about the date of this picture? The clothes, yes, my dear. What are the clothes? In what way are they telltale? He's somehow Pasteur is not in the picture, is he quite? There's a sort of lack of much sense of what do you call it? What is it when you wash your hands? Oh, well, you all know what I mean. And actually, about 20 years later, Eakins did another clinic, and you can see that medical science had advanced by at least 20 years, because they're all wearing very nicely, what is the word I want? Sterilized, yes, they're wearing nicely sterilized clothes, and you know, any old penknife won't do to cut into somebody. Again, you can see, of course, a distinguished surgeon and all the medical students, and so we can see Eakins, and again, you see the master surgeon himself, so you can see Eakins an absolutely extraordinary painter. He does many subjects. He does a lot of musical subjects, and then he does a number of subjects from the boxing ring. And it is fascinating to me that American art is full of boxing and wrestling in a way that I don't think European art is. And again, it's a fascinating comparison with the world of the Impressionists. Eakins chooses to do boxing and wrestling. Toulouse-Lautrec chooses to do the circus. Let's have a look at another Eakins, the countdown, the detail, and then Manet, a bullfight, or another Eakins, the victor, a really splendid and funny painting, I think. And you can see Eakins was fascinated by masculine athletes and was a great friend of Walt Whitman. And Degas does Miss Lola at the Cirque Fernando. You see? It's a fascinating comparison. Perhaps the most interesting of all these comparisons, though, is yet one other Eakins, a very famous Max Schmidt in the Single Skull on the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. And I want you to think, you know, well now, how does that relate to Impressionist painting? Just summon up some typical Impressionist images, and you see how closely it comes. Yet you see, the difference is that in America, it is not possible to take things with the kind of light sugar plum ease in the 1870s that you can if you're an Impressionist. There's a kind of earnestness and sternness and striving quality, which Eakins reports. This man is going to row extremely fast, and he's a racer. And he belongs to the most competitive society in the world, you see. Whereas these dear girls, let's have a look at the next. They're going to catch innumerable crabs, you know that. In fact, they're just about to catch a crab and they're not racing anybody. And there's going to be a picnic lunch very soon in this Monet. And I think that's a very instructive comparison. Okay, because what I want to do now, let's go on, is to think a little bit more about Manet and the Impressionists. And really, basically, if I can get you to think about two or three things, that Impressionism, of course, emerges out of a world of realism and naturalism. And there's one step from the naturalism of, what should we say, William Bell Scott, Steelworkers on the Tyne, or Ford Madox Brown, Picture of Work, the Impressionist approach to the Pre-Raphaelite approach to the Impressionist approach. Because, of course, the Impressionists were also deeply, deeply interested in facts. But they are no longer concerned with the sort of world which is revealed through the frozen apparatus of photography so much as vibrant and living light. And they take in a way photography seriously because they then take the evanescent moment, the instantaneity, the single little tickle of time. But, of course, they are working in a world of light strewn by color. And one way of seeing the Impressionists is to see them absolutely glued to the problems of opticity, of actually what you see, how your organ of sight works. We must remember that one of the things about the 19th century is the work of Gay-Lussac and Helmholtz, the whole understanding of the organism of the eye in relation to color. And you also have the great works of Chevreuil. And it's interesting that Chevreuil, who lived to be 100, is the subject of the first photographic interview and wrote extraordinarily important books on color. And the Impressionists, just as Constable had been interested in the new science of climatology, meteorology at the beginning of the 19th century, the Impressionists, and even more than Neo-Impressionists, become fascinated by optical issues. What exactly is the meaning of prismatic color, and so on and so forth. The chronology is important because we have to remember that Courbet is still alive in the 1860s, doesn't die till 1877, only 4 years before Manet dies. That Manet is about 10 years older than most of the Impressionists. And Manet starts painting and becomes famous as a very young man, really, in the early 1860s, at a time when Monet is just emerging from school, from doing his caricature portraits, when Renoir is just emerging from his early training as a painter of porcelain and enamel, when Pissarro, who's much older, is slowly finding his feet in the wake of Corot. And then you see the interesting thing happens, and it's at once touching and frightening, and that is, and most of you will not be able to appreciate it, is what happens when you become a rather older artist, and you've had your moment of leadership, and then some bloody young fellow comes along and says, "But that's old hat, my dear sir. What you're doing is boring and old-fashioned, and I'm going to do something different." Well, in essence, this is what happened in the late 1860s, that suddenly Monet and Renoir in particular, but with Basile and Pissarro and Sisley, started painting in a way which diverged importantly from the standards set by Manet. And then Manet, at the end of the 1860s, with a kind of frankness and vitality which is not common in artists, decides that he's going to learn from Impressionist practice. And here is a Manet And if you compare it with earlier Manets, the first thing you notice is a complete change in the color. The brilliance of the blues and the white, and the sense that the whole of the color is dominated by blue and its reflections on white, and its reflections on brown in various forms. And of course, one of the things that really ties people together at the end of the 1860s and beginning of the 1870s in France, in Paris, is the preoccupation with the river. And this is now a painting by Manet's sister-in-law, Berthe Morisot. And Berthe Morisot, again, like Manet, like Monet, like Renoir, like Sisley, suddenly decides that it is the water, it is the Parisian suburbs, it's Argenteuil, which is absolutely fascinating, and the sense of a summer holiday, sense of pretty girls with parasols, and the fascination, the technical fascination of painting the broken lights upon the water. The issue of reflection, the issue of how to deal with recession of form. You see, the whole issue here is so fascinating one. You have this shoulder, and the shoulder simply merges into the water. And there's hardly any attempt, there's just a very slight attempt. Morisot was in some ways lucky to be Manet's sister-in-law. In some ways, I think not entirely so, because her work is so often, I think, marred by too much attention to the slight flashiness of Manet's brushstroke. You can see in a Manet, and you can see in many Morisots, a fatness of pigment, a quantity of matière, as though paint were some kind of superior species of toothpaste which you had to smear upon the canvas. Wonderful control of whites in many places. And there's perhaps another thing which it's not fully clear, is that Manet was an enormously bold painter. And Berthe Morisot may have been encouraged into a slightly louder brushstroke than really suited her sensibility. But there you see her with these broken colors, with sudden little vivid touches of blue, and you see one of the things that is happening, and Manet gets it from the Impressionists. Manet, before the Impressionists, already has a sizable brushstroke. When the Impressionists get going, what they want to do is to relate the size and quality of their brushstroke to a notion of a particular little sunbeam, a little mote of light. And that mote of light allows them to make more and more transitions. One of the crucial things, of course, is the venturing into the open air. And we've seen this as a typical 19th century activity. We can see it in the watercolors of Gertin and Turner. We can see it in the oil sketches of Constable of Corot. But these are more than oil sketches, really, because these are going to be exhibited. And one of the things that really is so crucial is that moment in the 1860s when young Monsieur Monet, emulating Manet, in 1866 decides to paint an enormous picture of a picnic. And we look at a piece of that in a moment. And what does he do? The picture is so large that you couldn't dream, really, if you hadn't taken leave of your senses of painting out of doors. I mean, you know, it's the sort of thing to paint in the studio, because the number of flies that would bump into it and get attached to the wet paint, and the wind blowing it over at you and so on and so forth. I mean, absolutely crazy thing to do. Monet not only does it, but in order to be able to see round it and see over it, he digs an enormous trench in the garden so that he can lower it into the trench, so that he can look over the top, so that he can match his optical sensation with pigment on the canvas. Now, there's no simpler way of understanding the seriousness with which the Impressionists want to match their visual sensation with pigment upon the canvas. There's no greater way of understanding. I mean, just imagine digging and digging and digging before you do your painting. I mean, there's a difference between the planairism of that and Turner's rapid sketches or Constable's rapid sketches. It's a kind of seriousness of application which is scientific in part and is absolutely determined, you see. And it is deeply involved with the issue of color. And the Impressionists are people who sacrifice, amongst other things, a good deal of compositional possibility because they want to deal with colored light. There are, of course, other elements. If you look at this, it's no wonder that one wants to talk about photography because of the informal arrangement in this Berthe Morisot, running right off with this strange diagonal, very, very obvious in a great many Degas. Another Berthe Morisot, and here I want to draw your attention to the brilliance of the green. Berthe Morisot is so much more under the influence of Manet than she is of Monet or Renoir, and when Manet becomes influenced by Impressionism, he goes for green in an absolutely stentorian fashion, and he uses large quantities of emerald. The color is not broken up to the degree. The brush stroke is broken up, but the color is not broken up, and indeed this kind of slashing stroke is so characteristic of Manet and much less characteristic of Renoir. Anyhow, there's Berthe Morisot, and here is Renoir, and I swear, you know, that if you didn't know, you might easily think that this was a Berthe Morisot. Because the brushstroke has so much in common, and the color has so much in common. Perhaps the lingering of this black here in this croquet game, and just a certain kind of sheer arrogance of stylishness lets you know that this is indeed a Manet. And here's a Manet portrait of Berthe Morisot. And she must have been a most wonderful person, don't you think? And he also, of course, was extraordinary, had such a sense of elegance, had such a sense of how you could use black, which, of course, as the Impressionists proper was said not to use, to create these elegant patterns, these elegant silhouettes. And indeed, there's something more complicated, because one of the things that I've told you, and you know perfectly well, is that into this confluence you have Courbet and you have Millet and the members of the Barbizon school, and then you have Manet, and then you have this preoccupation with color and light and notes, and then you have something which is totally contradictory to certain elements of Impressionist practice, which is a Japanese woodblock print with these immense solid passages of color and with its absolute elegance of silhouette. Now, with Manet, one of the things you have to realize is that he's one of the great digesters of art. It is, I think, not surprising that Picasso liked Manet, because Manet, like Picasso, can borrow from all over the place. And let's have a look at the next, because we'll see Manet. Here he is himself, and you see he is a very elegant fellow, and very self-consciously elegant. Very self-conscious in the lovely pearl pin in his cravat, this high collar, his lovely moleskin jacket, and so on and so forth. Let's have a look at the next. And I've already pointed out to you that this is based upon a Renaissance prototype, Raphael. Here is a Chardin, and here is a Manet version of a Chardin. Let's have a look at the next. There's a Chardin. Next, please. Next. Next. I think, is it time for everybody to go? That's what it is. Well, have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.
I'm doing my paper on Chiraco's fight with the Surrealists, yet I couldn't find too many books on it.
On who?
De Chiraco's fight.
The Kiriko?
Yeah, him.
Yes.
Yeah, his fight with the Surrealists. When he said he didn't like them anymore and decided that he'd be doing his paintings.
Well,